Are you prepared if the Trump tariffs crash the stock market? What if Trump supports Putin and Ukraine is defeated and Russia comes for Europe next? This is the second most stressful time that I've seen in the market over my 17 years of investment experience, including 4 years that I spent as the CEO of the investment company Indexo here in Europe. It was only worse back in 2008 when I was a young banker on Wall Street during the financial crisis. Today reminds me of the fear that I felt as Lehman Brothers went bankrupt and the market crashed, and it seemed that the whole world was collapsing.
Excuse me, sir. How are you feeling?
How do you think?
That said, every crisis also brings opportunities for investors. So in this video, I will show you 5 steps that you should take to prepare for the risks in the market. This is how you can protect your savings, but also keep making money in these troubling times. But first, here's an important warning. So remember how in February 2020, news of the COVID pandemic shocked the world? Everybody was terrified that the global economy was going to collapse. So a lot of regular investors started selling stocks, and in a matter of weeks, the S&P 500 crashed by 30%. Then the world realized that remote work was possible, governments supported the economy, and the market shot back up. But a lot of people who sold on the way down, they lost money. At the time, I managed the pension fund that I co-founded here in Latvia, and we didn't get scared. We just kept investing, kept buying, and that made our clients a lot of money. Whenever you see bad news in the press, you have to realize that the world is a complicated place. And just because the news is bad, it doesn't mean that it's going to have a terrible effect on the markets. For example, even if Trump puts big tariffs on Europe and stops supporting Ukraine, obviously, that's bad in the short term. But what if it forces Europe to pull together and deregulate and become more effective and more productive? Over the long term, it could actually help the markets. So my warning is this: don't jump to conclusions. It's almost never a good idea to simply get scared and sell everything and stop investing. That is a form of market timing, and it's usually an expensive mistake. But, of course, we should not ignore the risks. So here is the first step that you should take to protect your money. And to help you understand it, let's go back to the great financial crisis. So in early 2009, my friend Jerome sold half his stock portfolio. Now, it was a terrible time to sell. The S&P 500 had fallen by 50%. Stocks were super cheap, so he was selling his investments at a bad price. But the problem was he had no choice. He needed money to pay his bills to support his family. You don't want to end up in the same situation. If the market does crash, you need to have some cash sitting around so you can cover your expenses without selling your investments. This is called a safety cushion. It's money that you keep in a high-yield savings account and you don't invest it, so that if things start going bad and maybe you lose your job or have some big unexpected expenses, you have these reserves and you don't have to start selling your stock investments. But the safety cushion is only a band-aid. It's a short-term solution. If the market crashes, and if it keeps crashing, it can become a real problem for those investors who need to take out cash. So if you are retired or you are about to retire, this is a major issue. So this takes us to our second step for protecting your money. And to understand it, think back to when you were 5 years old. If you fell down and scraped your knee, it was painful, but it was actually a useful life lesson. You learned how to walk more carefully. If you fall down at the age of 40, it's painful, but still not a big deal. But if you fall down at the age of 70, that can be really, really dangerous. And it's similar with investing. If you experience a major market crisis when you're 30 years old and you're just starting to invest and you've got many years ahead of you, it's actually not a problem. It's an opportunity. You can buy stocks at a cheaper price. You can learn some useful lessons. It's quite a valuable experience for any new investor. But if you are 65 and about to retire, and then the market crashes and wipes out half your savings, that can be a tragedy. So you want to make sure to reduce the risk in your portfolio as you get older, as you get closer to the time when you will need the money. You do this by using the glide path method. You glide from higher risk in the beginning to lower risk as time goes on. Usually when you're 20, 30, even 40 years old, you can put 100% of your investments into the stock market. And then, as you get older, you start to reduce the proportion of your money that goes into stocks, and you introduce lower risk investments like bond funds or simply some money kept in a high yield savings account. At the age of 65, most experts would recommend having no more than 50 or 60% of your money in stocks, and the rest should be in much lower risk investments. So then, if the market does fall by 50%, It's still painful. Your portfolio could fall by 20 or 30%, but it's much less painful. And you've got these more reliable investments, these lower risk investments, which you can use to finance the first years of your retirement. Okay, so these two steps assume that the markets will keep on working the same as historically. There's some kind of crisis, the market goes down, and then it recovers. But I'm also hearing many Europeans who are saying, look, America is in trouble. Trump and Elon Musk, they are disrupting the American system. So I'm scared to invest in the S&P 500 for the next 10 or 20 years. I don't know what's going to happen with this American market. This presents a tricky dilemma because historically, America has been the most profitable place for stock investors. I grew up in the last days of the Soviet Union, and throughout my childhood, I would watch American movies and buy into this myth of America as this amazing place with the coolest style and the best democratic principles and the richest people. And then, of course, later I moved to America and I studied there and I worked on Wall Street, and I saw the huge problems they have with a horrible medical system and gun violence and homelessness and drugs and everything else. But at the same time, it's true that there's almost no country in the world where people are as entrepreneurial, as oriented toward making money. There's a reason Warren Buffett said, don't bet against America. The American stock market has been unstoppable. Or has it? Well, of course, over the 20th century, American stocks did outperform global stocks by about 2 percentage points per year, so that's a lot. But you have to keep in mind that the 20th century included 2 world wars that devastated Europe, while America basically benefited. Now, over the past 50 years, sure, America has also outperformed, but actually, this has almost all been in the last 15 years since 2010. Between 1973 and 2010, American and European stock markets were basically neck and neck. They got the same result. But over the past 15 years, big American tech companies, they've exploded. The stock prices have become much more expensive, and that's why American stock investors have done a lot better. So looking at this picture, I can of course see a scenario where the American stock market will continue to outperform. Maybe Elon Musk will cut regulations, the economy will speed up, AI will really explode, and sure, American stocks could keep going up and up and up, even though today they are already quite expensive. But I can also easily see a scenario where the American market really struggles for many years because Trump and Elon actually harm the economy and maybe the AI bubble pops. And in that case, other markets like Europe or Asia could do better. Now, this is where the power of diversification comes in. I personally use an ETF called the iShares MSCI All Country World Index UCITS ETF, which invests in stocks all around the world in many different countries. Now, over the past 10 years, investing just in America would have been more profitable. But I'm pretty comfortable being more diversified, especially looking at today's uncertain situation. So if you want to reduce your exposure to America, you can use a global stock ETF. If you want to avoid America entirely, you also have choices. You can invest in European stocks or Asian stocks. Obviously, every market has its own risks, but the S&P 500 is certainly not your only possible choice. So this would be the third step to protect your money: diversify geographically. So far, we've only talked about the risk in the market, but what about the safety of your brokerage, of your investment account? So there's one question that I've received which is pretty extreme, but maybe it's worth talking about. What if America really breaks down and Trump gets really crazy, there's a big conflict with Europe, and this somehow harms our American investments, or maybe our investments held with American-owned brokerages? Well, on the face of it, it seems unthinkable. But of course, if we look at historical examples of countries that have kind of collapsed, foreign investors can be the first whose rights get hurt. For example, look at what happened with Russia when it invaded Ukraine. A lot of foreign investors lost their money. I personally don't expect this to happen with America. It's built on capitalism. There are too many rich people there whose interests would be threatened if people no longer believed in the infrastructure of investing. But I can get the concern. I understand the concern. So to me, it's another reason not to put everything into American stocks, and maybe not to keep all your investments in an American brokerage. But there's an even more painful question that I've received from people in my native country, in Latvia. as well as people in other Eastern European countries like Lithuania, Estonia, Poland, and others. What if my country gets invaded? What's going to happen to my brokerage? What happens to the safety of my money? And it's horrible that we even have to think about this. Certainly, I'm still optimistic that it's not going to happen, but I think you have to be blind to completely discount the possibility. For example, back in February 2022, if things had happened a bit differently, Russia could have taken over Ukraine in just a few days. It's very likely Russia would have been sanctioned and cut off from the global financial system. And who knows what would have happened to any Ukrainian investments in the S&P 500 or anything else. Certainly, it's impossible to reliably predict what could happen if a country gets invaded and your brokerage is right there in the middle of the war. So here again, my personal answer is diversification. I live in Latvia. I still have a lot of investments in Latvian banks, Latvian brokerages, but I have also opened brokerage accounts with Saxo, which is a bank in Denmark, with the Giro, a bank in Germany, with Interactive Brokers in Ireland. I've got some cash sitting in a bank in Spain. So basically, I have backup options. And frankly, in today's environment, I think that's just common sense. So that's step number 4, diversify your accounts globally. And then we get to step number 5, which is about when should you make these preparations. Now, many people don't know this, but I'm actually a writer. 12 years ago, I wrote this book called The Cattle Express, which became a bestseller in Latvia. It was about my experience on Wall Street and also my family's experiences during World War II, when Latvia was invaded first by Russia, then by Germany, and then by Russia again. And doing research for that book, it was so moving to read the thoughts and comments of people at the time. And you could tell back then that war was coming. There were problems on the horizon, but people still couldn't believe it. They couldn't believe that their everyday lives could change so dramatically. And I think there's something we can learn from that. Now, I'm an optimist. I believe we will have peace in Europe. I believe Europe is going to come out of this stronger, and even America might. Any big challenge can actually be a big opportunity for improvement. And with technologies like AI and quantum computing, I think we have a bright future ahead of us. That said, I want to be ready for different scenarios, including negative ones. And it's much better to prepare today rather than wait for when things become clear, because by the time things become clear, it is often too late. So the 5th step that I want to share with you is to implement the 4 steps that we discussed now. If you're not a professional investor, it can be difficult to keep track of what's happening in the market. You don't want to constantly watch the news because that is really stressful, but you can't also afford to ignore the news. If that sounds familiar, you might want to join my newsletter for European investors. It's got over 70,000 subscribers in 34 European countries. We cover useful investment tips and important market news, and you can subscribe by clicking the link in the description.